In May of 1941, deep in the freezing, storm-tossed waters of the North Atlantic, 16 British warships closed in on a single German target. They were hunting the most feared battleship in Europe, a vessel that had just destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy in under 3 minutes. For nearly 2 hours, they fired over 2,800 shells at it. 400 found their mark. Torpedoes came from every direction, some launched from less than 3,000 yards away. And still, the Bismarck refused to sink. At first, naval historians did what any reasonable observer would do when reviewing the battle logs decades later. They assumed the records had to be exaggerated. The idea that a single ship could absorb that much punishment and still stay afloat already felt like pushing credibility as far as it could go. Any battleship on record had succumbed to far less. Any rational engineering analysis suggested the Bismarck should have been at the bottom of the ocean within 45 minutes of the first salvo. But something was off. The numbers were real. The shell counts didn't match what should have been enough to destroy any warship ever built. Then came the shock. These weren't inflated reports. This was the Bismarck, and almost nothing about how it fought, how it died, and what happened afterward followed the rules of modern naval warfare. See, the wreck site discovered in 1989 isn't just any underwater grave. It's a time capsule. A nearly intact battleship sealed by sudden burial under nearly 5 kilometers of crushing ocean. Armor plates, torn hulls, scattered debris, deck planking still largely in place after half a century. Entire snapshots of a desperate final battle preserved in stunning detail. Torpedo strike patterns visible on the hull sides. Gouges in the armor belt where shells struck but failed to penetrate. And, in that darkness at the bottom of the volcanic seamount where it came to rest, the biggest mystery anyone had ever encountered about modern naval warfare. As researchers recovered more data from expeditions across decades, from Robert Ballard in 1989, to David Mearns in 2001, to James Cameron in 2002, dozens of photographs, sonar scans, and forensic analyses, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't a fluke or an exaggeration. The evidence was consistent, overwhelming, and unlike anything in the record. What emerged was a portrait of a sinking so strange, so improbable, so full of impossible coincidences that it instantly reset everything historians thought they understood about the hunt for the Bismarck. News hit like a thunderclap. When the first expedition team measured the hull damage carefully and mapped every penetration, they ran the analysis again and again, convinced the conclusions had to be wrong. But they weren't. The evidence pointed to a ship that the Royal Navy never truly destroyed with gunfire. It pointed to a vessel that refused to die on British terms. Researchers were stunned. If those findings were real, the Bismarck wasn't just a tough battleship. It was something that shouldn't have sunk the way the official textbooks claimed. Its survival for nearly 2 hours of point-blank fire implied naval armor far more resilient, far more advanced, and far more stubborn than anyone had imagined. A vessel this durable could only exist in a world pushing engineering to its absolute limit. What kind of factory built monsters like this? The Bismarck was absurdly armored. The most conservative estimates put 70% of its hull as impervious to standard British 15-inch shells. Some estimates placed its command tower doors at 8 inches of solid steel. 8 inches. That's thicker than the concrete wall of a military bunker. Its internal subdivision was so complex that watertight compartments numbered in the hundreds. For context, the most protected British battleship of the era had armor that British shipwrights themselves admitted was outclassed by what the Germans had achieved. So the Bismarck wasn't just tough, it was in a category of its own, built to a philosophy that bordered on obsession. But here's what I find fascinating. How did engineers even design a ship this resistant to damage? Well, German naval architects followed a pretty unusual philosophy. The Bismarck's main armor belt was next-generation face-hardened Wotan Hart steel, engineered specifically to reduce spalling inside the ship. So when a shell hit, it wouldn't just penetrate or bounce. It would be decapped by multiple layers of homogeneous deck armor that made it lose penetrating power mid-impact. The sloped armor underneath the main belt caught any shells that managed to break through. It was essentially a layered trap for incoming projectiles, each layer stealing a bit more of the shell's kinetic energy until there was nothing left to explode with. But there's a deeper question here. Why was the Bismarck so much harder to sink than any battleship that came before it? The answer hinges on obsession. See, the Kriegsmarine was dramatically smaller than the Royal Navy. Germany simply couldn't compete on numbers, not even close. So they competed on quality. And that shaped almost everything about their flagship. Its protection, its redundancy, its fire control systems, even the psychological intimidation factor it projected across every admiralty in Europe. Think about it this way. The more impenetrable the ship, the more ammunition enemies needed to bring it down. More ammunition meant longer battles, greater risk of reinforcements arriving, and the ability to withstand encounters that would sink any other vessel instantly. So when the Royal Navy finally cornered the Bismarck on May 27th, they weren't just engaging a battleship. They were fighting an engineering philosophy, a doctrine built on the idea that no single enemy action should ever be fatal. And it pointed to a battle far longer, far stranger, and far more improbable than anyone expected. To understand the Bismarck's final hours, you have to understand its world. Step back to May 1941, just 2 years into World War II. Britain is starving. Rationing has become so severe that wasting food has become a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. Global shipping convoys are being devastated by German U-boat wolf packs sinking 30 to 50 supply ships every single month. Ecosystems of supply routes are collapsing under the strain, and the Atlantic is turning into something almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. Supply lines were far more fragile than anyone admits now. The convoys from America were providing 50% of Britain's food and all of its oil. Imagine a war effort that never paused, not even at night. A conflict where the ocean itself felt like a constant hunting ground. No safe harbors, no quiet months, just relentless U-boat warfare stretching from Iceland to the Caribbean. Convoys burned, ships vanished in the fog, and losses grew staggering. Because for an island nation, vulnerability at sea removed the biggest advantage of all. If the Bismarck broke into the Atlantic and joined the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which had already sunk 22 Allied ships in just 2 months the previous year, Britain's lifeline could be severed entirely. But today's naval strategists, the admirals, the War College instructors, the historians, are still debating whether Britain could have survived if Bismarck had broken through freely. Modern simulations press against the upper limits of what convoy defense could have allowed. To push beyond their capacity into Bismarck territory required a ship of exactly this caliber, deployed for months, devastating supply routes at will. The Bismarck couldn't hide. Its massive profile needed that open ocean to roam, to pick off merchants 20 at a time. The wreck site itself reveals this story in detail that photographs from 1941 never could. Layer after layer of forensic analysis contains evidence of combat damage. There are gouge marks from shell ricochets, some as deep as dinner plates. Early analysis of the hull suggests armor plates that held even when overlapped by multiple direct hits. They were not sleek protection panels, but heavy layered laminate designed for absorbing everything thrown at them. This was not a fragile, outdated design. It was a fortress hull. Overlapping joints, compartmentalized flooding, self-sealing fuel systems, and even magnetic torpedo countermeasures built into the sides of the ship. Visibility at the bottom is poor, sound muffled by constant deep-sea currents and sediment. In such an environment, documentation could be a massive challenge. A wrecked battleship could hide its secrets for 50 years, its damage obscured by rust, its true fate hidden by murky tannin-like deposits. Time and pressure would keep its mysteries sealed, allowing it to endure generations of speculation, then release clues over decades, teasing researchers with partial answers. The Bismarck in this context is not an accident. It is the direct logical outcome of an extreme engineering program. High expectations, abundant resources, and a wartime race for technological dominance. Perfect for slow, patient terror across shipping lanes that Britain could not afford to lose. So here's where the story stops being just remarkable engineering and starts becoming genuinely strange. Because on May 24th, 1941, something happened that simply shouldn't have been possible. The HMS Hood, the largest and most prestigious warship in the Royal Navy, opened fire on the Bismarck at 24 kilometers distance. 3 minutes later, the hood no longer existed. Let me say that again. 3 minutes. A 46,000-ton battleship with a crew of 1,818 men was split in half by a single projectile. And here's what is truly strange about this. Statistically, that shot should never have worked. The Bismarck's 380mm shell hit the hood at an almost impossible angle. It sliced through the deck like butter, penetrated the engine compartment, and red-hot shrapnel punctured the adjacent bulkhead, entering directly into the aft powder magazine. 112 tons of cordite ignited. At first, Hood's crew heard only a faint crackling. Like a quiet fireplace, the survivors later described. Then the pressure built. Flames rushed up through the ventilation shafts. And suddenly, a firestorm burst through the upper deck, and the ship tore itself in half. The force was so great that debris pellet the Prince of Wales half a mile away. Out of 1,318 men on board, 3 survived. 3. One of them, Bob Tilburn, was lying down near one of the hood's forward funnels when the ship disintegrated around him. He got caught on an antenna mast and was nearly dragged to the depths, but air bubbles from the boiler explosions pushed him back to the surface. Ted Briggs, another survivor, testified that his final sight of Admiral Holland was of him sitting in his admiral's chair in utter dejection, making no attempt to escape the sinking wreck. But here's the part that is truly disturbing. As the hood sank, with its bow pointing vertically toward the sky, its doomed turrets fired one final salvo. A last shot. A salute from the dying crew to the enemy that had destroyed them. In London, Winston Churchill got the news and went into a rage. "British battleships do not turn away from the enemy," he declared. "There must be retribution for the hood." And here begins the strangest naval chase in history. The Bismarck escaped. It had just destroyed the most famous ship in the Royal Navy, caused damage to the Prince of Wales, and was now fleeing toward occupied France for repairs. But there was a problem. The Bismarck was bleeding. A 14-inch shell from the Prince of Wales had pierced the bow, tearing away 1,000 tons of fuel oil, and leaving an oil trail visible on the ocean for kilometers behind. Despite this, Admiral Gunther Lutyens managed to shake off his pursuers. For 31 agonizing hours, nobody in the Royal Navy knew where the Bismarck was. And then he made the mistake. Unfamiliar with the new British radar technology, Lutyens didn't realize he had escaped. He assumed he was still being shadowed. And he did something disastrous. He sent a 30-minute radio message back to the German High Command. The British intercepted the transmission, triangulated the position, and for a moment they thought they had the Bismarck back. Except someone made a cartographic error that sounds like something from a movie script. The coordinates were plotted on a Mercator map instead of a mnemonic map. The result? The British fleet turned in the wrong direction. Steamed away from the Bismarck, the German ship was free. Again. At this point, the British situation was critical. Fuel was running low across the entire pursuit fleet. Some ships would have to turn back within hours. Churchill paced restlessly in London, haunted by the possibility that Bismarck might actually reach France. Then something improbable happened. A Catalina flying boat, recently supplied to the British by the Americans, spotted the Bismarck 700 nautical miles west of the French coast. But now there was a timing problem. The British battleships were hundreds of miles away. Bismarck would reach German air cover before they could intercept. The only thing that could stop her was something bordering on absurd. Canvas and wire biplanes from the late 1930s called swordfish. Aircraft so outdated they were nicknamed string bags by their own crews. And what happened next is one of the strangest moments in military history. Here's the thing about the Bismarck that nobody anticipated. Its anti-aircraft defense systems were so advanced they became useless. The ship's fire control computers were calibrated for modern aircraft flying at modern speeds. But the swordfish weren't modern. They flew so low and so slow, sometimes barely over 90 miles per hour, that Bismarck's predictive systems literally could not calculate their trajectories. Heavy anti-aircraft guns struggled to track them accurately. The shells meant to blow them from the sky were timed for faster targets. Worse, when Bismarck's shells did hit the Swordfish, they frequently passed cleanly through the canvas and wood without detonating. The aircraft was so fragile that the mechanical fuses in the projectiles didn't react to them. In an act of desperate creativity, the Germans began firing their main batteries into the water directly in front of the approaching planes, creating massive walls of water designed to knock the aircraft down. Columns of tens of tons of water rising into the air like underwater explosions. But the Swordfish simply weaved around them. And here comes the improbable moment that sealed the Bismarck's fate. At 8:47 p.m. on May 26th, in a 1 in a million chance, a single torpedo struck the Bismarck directly on its rudder. Just one torpedo, on a target the size of a football stadium, in the only place vulnerable enough to matter. 200 kilograms of TNT detonated in the rudder complex. The hull acted like a springboard, sending a shockwave through the entire ship. And here, we discovered something that would only be confirmed 60 years later, when James Cameron dove to the wreck. The torpedo may not have even struck the ship directly. Cameron's team concluded in 2002 that the torpedo was likely caught in the wake of Bismarck's propellers, pulled up against the bottom of the hull, and exploded between the two rudders. The leading edge of the starboard rudder was forced forward into the central propeller, which was still spinning. The propeller sliced through the rudder like a saw, cutting through steel. Fragments of the propeller remained permanently embedded in the rudder. The result? The Bismarck was locked into a slow, useless circle. It simply couldn't go anywhere anymore. Lucian sent the final message. Ship unable to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. So here's the question everyone wants to know. How did the Bismarck actually fight when cornered? Well, forget everything you've seen in movies. The Bismarck wasn't some unstoppable Leviathan charging at its enemies. This wasn't an agile destroyer or a nimble cruiser. The Bismarck was simply too wounded for that. 40,000 tons of steel don't maneuver quickly when a torpedo has jammed the rudder. It drifts, circles, fights hydrodynamics with every meter. But with a crippled rudder, everything changes. In the final 72 hours, the Bismarck behaved less like a modern battleship and more like a floating fortress. Slow, silent, half paralyzed. It used the storm-tossed waters as camouflage, slipping between waves and rain squalls with only the faintest course corrections. For a ship this size, mobility wasn't a luxury, it was survival. It didn't chase, it didn't sprint. It waited hours, nearly a full night, almost motionless in a slow circle, until the British forces closed in. And then, in one of the strangest details of the whole chase, came the Polish. Out of the darkness, against orders, came the tiny Polish destroyer, Piorun. The Poles would attack anyone after the brutal occupation of their nation. A vessel a sixth the size of the Bismarck. Piorun signaled to the German battleship, "I am Polish," and then charged, firing its 4.7-inch guns into Bismarck's superstructure. The guns could do little against that armor, but Captain Płowski knew that by harrying the ship through the night, he could wear down German morale. The little destroyer only vanished back into the darkness when fuel reserves got dangerously low. That moment alone, a lone Polish ship challenging the most feared battleship in Europe in the middle of a storm, is one of the most improbable confrontations of the entire war. And when the main fight came at dawn, the damage was terrifying. Ballistic models estimate that the Rodney's 16-inch guns could deliver over 2,000 pounds of kinetic force per shell, more than enough to crush a destroyer's hull in an instant. Modern naval doctrine relies on range and mobility to finish enemies. But at the Bismarck's condition, range barely mattered. The Rodney eventually closed to under 3,000 yards, point-blank range for battleship guns. At that distance, kinetic energy alone was catastrophic, even when shells failed to detonate properly. At 9:02 a.m. on May 27th, a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward command tower. The 8-inch blast door was torn from its hinges. The concussion killed nearly everyone inside instantly, almost certainly including Admiral Lutyens and Captain Lindemann. In a single shot, the Bismarck lost its entire senior command chain. But the ship kept fighting. Junior officers took over. Turrets continued firing, now without central coordination, shooting almost blindly due to the ship's instability. For nearly 2 hours, the British poured steel into the Bismarck at increasingly close ranges. Survivors described the scene on board as hell. Mountains of flesh and bone on the decks. Panicked sailors falling through shell holes directly into the burning compartments below. Fire consuming everything. Twisted bulkheads. And still, the Bismarck refused to sink. By 9:31, virtually every main turret was out of action. The secondary armament continued to fire sporadically, but against enemy battleships, they were useless. The senior surviving officer, the chief of damage repair stations, gave the final order. Measure 5. Scuttle the ship. Deny the Royal Navy its prize. Engineers began placing dynamite on the seacocks. Drainage pumps were opened in reverse. And here is the question that still divides historians today. What actually sank the Bismarck? This question remained open for nearly 50 years. The British insisted that their guns and torpedoes had sunk the ship. The surviving Germans, only 114 out of a crew of over 2,200, insisted that they had scuttled the Bismarck themselves, that the demolition charges had done the job. In 1989, Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who had found the Titanic, decided to resolve the debate. He found the Bismarck at nearly 5 kilometers of depth, resting on the side of an extinct underwater volcano. And what he found was shocking. The Bismarck was remarkably intact. The deck still had much of its teak planking, and, crucially, its side armor revealed something that stunned historians. Most of the British shell impacts had not penetrated the vital areas. Only a few penetrations were found on the main 320mm armor belt. Most impacts had devastated the superstructure, the part above the deck, but the armored heart of the ship remained intact. Nearly 400 direct hits from the largest guns in the Royal Navy had failed to penetrate where it mattered. Conclusion? The Bismarck probably sank because the Germans sank it themselves. The demolition charges, combined with the opened seacocks and the Dorsetshire's final torpedoes, did what hours of battleship bombardment could not. The Royal Navy had poured more than 2,800 shells into a ship that simply refused to die from gunfire alone. In the end, the Bismarck went down on its own terms. But there is one more strange layer to this story. When Ballard examined the wreckage, he discovered something nobody expected. The stern of the Bismarck, the entire rear section, including the famous rudder compartment, was missing. Not just damaged, missing. Separated from the rest of the hull. The theory was later confirmed by Cameron in 2002. The stern of the Bismarck probably broke off during the sinking itself, ripped away by hydrodynamic forces. The structure had already been fatally weakened by the torpedo strike on the rudder. When the ship began to sink and tilted, the water pressure was too much. The stern simply tore itself off. How did they figure this out? Because the armored bulkhead at the stern was still in place on the main hull, but the rear edge showed a clean break. No impact damage. During the Bismarck's entire slide down the volcanic slope, the stern never touched the mud. It was already gone long before the ship reached the bottom. And now the strangest story of them all. The one almost nobody believes the first time they hear it. When the Bismarck sank, the British destroyer HMS Cossack passed through the area searching for survivors. Most German sailors in the water were already dead. The Atlantic temperature was 8 degrees Celsius. Others, indoctrinated to believe the British would torture them, had shot themselves before rescue. The British sailors were pulling away, heavy of heart, when they saw movement. A small plank of wood floating in the waves, and on top of it, a very angry black and white cat. Somehow, in the middle of the inferno of Bismarck's final combat, that cat, the ship's mascot, named Oscar by the Germans, had escaped unharmed. The British rescued him and renamed him Sam, and then things got weird. A few weeks later, HMS Cossack, the ship that had saved Sam, was torpedoed and sank. Sam was found floating on a plank again, transferred to HMS Ark Royal, the most famous aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy. The Ark Royal also sank. Sam survived. Again. The British sailors began calling him Unsinkable Sam. 3 ships he served on were sunk, including one of the most feared battleships of World War II, and he survived every single one. He lived out the rest of his life in a sailor's home in Belfast until 1955. Think about that for a moment. If you were an Axis officer looking for bad omens, a German cat who survived the sinking of the Bismarck only to sink 2 British ships afterward would be disturbing. So, what makes the Bismarck's sinking so abnormal? It's not just that it took 16 ships and thousands of shells to bring down a single target. It's not just that canvas and wood biplanes mortally wounded the most advanced battleship in Europe. It's not just that the British probably never actually sank it, that in the end, it was the Germans themselves who opened the seacocks. It's that almost no element of this story followed the rules. An impossible shell destroyed the hood. A cartographic error nearly saved the Bismarck. A torpedo in a 1 in a million chance sealed its fate. An entire stern section simply ripped off on the way to the bottom. A lone Polish destroyer charged the most feared ship in Europe in the middle of a storm. And a cat survived all of it. So, if the Bismarck was such a successful design, perfectly armored for its environment, why didn't Germany just build more of them? Well, the answer is both simple and tragic. The world changed, and the Bismarck couldn't save it. After May 1941, the Kriegsmarine's strategy began to collapse, gradually at first, then more rapidly. Confidence in surface raiders dropped by several critical degrees over the course of a few months. And for a navy built on capital ships like the Bismarck, that was a death sentence. Here's the thing about being a surface raider. Your effectiveness is directly tied to environmental conditions. When radar improved, when air cover expanded, when aircraft carriers proved their worth, your doctrine slowed down. Repairs took longer. Movement became riskier. Survival rates plummeted. For a program as ambitious as the Bismarck class, this was catastrophic. It needed an enormous amount of naval support just to maintain its missions. But with a slower strategic environment, it couldn't hunt as effectively. It couldn't digest losses fast enough, and it couldn't build replacements fast enough to compete with other navies. Essentially, German surface power starved in slow motion. But it wasn't just the technology. The entire ecosystem of naval warfare was shifting. Aircraft carriers, which had been relatively small and insignificant during the age of the battleship, were beginning to diversify and grow larger. They were far more flexible, which meant they could remain active even when storms raged, and they were competing for the same resources that giant battleships depended on. Meanwhile, the vast open ocean that surface raiders had thrived in was disappearing. Radar coverage expanded relentlessly. Long-range aircraft reached further each month. The blind, vulnerable environment that the Bismarck had relied on was vanishing. And perhaps most importantly, Hitler himself had lost his nerve. The loss of Bismarck so shook him that he personally ordered that no major German surface unit could sortie into the Atlantic again without his explicit authorization. The Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau. The entire surface fleet that had been meant to support the Bismarck concept was mothballed in fjords in Norway and France, where they would slowly be picked off by British air raids. And yes, German surface raiding died. Not from overwhelming defeat, not from invasion, not from treaty. It died because the Bismarck was lost in a single engagement. That's all it took. A jammed rudder from a single torpedo, one of 9 dropped by obsolete biplanes, and the largest capital ship program in Axis history simply stopped existing. And that should make us think. Because technology doesn't just shape warfare. It defines the upper and lower limits of what strategy is even possible. The Bismarck was a ship that should never have gone down so spectacularly. It was too armored, too expensive, too dependent on a doctrine that was always destined to change. But for a brief moment in naval history, all the conditions aligned perfectly. And for 9 days, the largest battleship that ever sailed ruled the imagination of the Atlantic. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only wreckage and questions. See, the story of the Bismarck isn't really about a battleship. It's about a world turned up several degrees more desperate, more inventive, and more brutal than the one that came before. About what happens when engineering outpaces strategy. About a ship so overbuilt that its enemies couldn't sink it with gunfire alone. and a crew so dedicated that they opened the Seacocks themselves rather than surrender. About 16 ships, 400 direct hits, 1 jammed rudder, 1 tiny Polish destroyer, 1 cat that somehow survived 3 sinkings, and 1 hull resting silently at 4,800 meters beneath the surface, still holding its secrets. 2,086 men died on the Bismarck. 1,415 died on the Hood. Nearly 3,500 lives ended in under 4 days. Not because someone had an overwhelming advantage, but because accidents, errors, and pure chance aligned in ways no strategist could have predicted. That's why the Bismarck's sinking still fascinates us 80 years later. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the deadliest, but because it was the strangest. And in the darkness of the Atlantic, nearly 5 kilometers below the surface, the Bismarck is still there. Silent. Dark. Holding Admiral Lutyens and Captain Lindemann in the crushed remains of the command tower. Still guarding mysteries we may never fully understand. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and the strangest ship of the Second World War will continue keeping its own, for as long as the sea holds it in place